This video is brought to you by Brilliant. On Friday last week, Russia opened up what looks like essentially a second front in Ukraine, sending thousands of troops south from Belgorod towards Kharkiv oblast. While Ukrainian commanders originally claimed to have repulsed the attack, over the weekend Russian forces took a handful of small towns and moved towards Vovchansk, which has since been evacuated. While a full-on assault of Kharkiv looks unlikely at the moment, this nonetheless presents Ukraine with the difficult question of how many troops it can afford to divert from the front lines to deal with the new front, given that Russia is already making slow but steady progress in places like Donetsk and Luhansk. So in this video, we're going to have a look at what's happening in Kharkiv, how worried Ukraine should be about it, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's just dive straight into it and look at what's currently happening in Kharkiv. On Friday, after months of anticipation, Russian forces began an assault moving south from Belgorod, across the northern border of Kharkiv Oblast and towards the town of Vovchansk, which lies about 75 kilometers northeast of Kharkiv city. We say after months of anticipation because the Ukrainians and everyone else have known about this attack for ages. Satellite imagery has been showing a massive Russian troop buildup of about 30,000 personnel around Belgorod for the past few weeks, if not months. But Ukraine wasn't able to do too much about it, because, at least according to disgruntled Ukrainian officials, Ukraine's Western allies wouldn't let them use Western-supplied weapons to strike targets inside Russian territory. The one exception here is the UK. During a visit to Kiev in early May, Foreign Secretary David Cameron gave the green light for strikes inside Russia, stating that Ukraine has a right to strike military targets inside Russia, quote, just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine. But this wasn't enough, both because Cameron's interjection came a bit late in the day, and because the UK only supplies a small fraction of Ukraine's long-range missile systems. Anyway, the attack began with heavy bombing of Volchansk in the early hours of Friday morning, forcing a hurried evacuation of the 3,000 or so Ukrainians living in the town. This was then followed by a series of probing movements along the Belgorod-Kharkiv border. Originally, Ukrainian officials sounded optimistic, and the Ukrainian Defense Ministry released a statement saying that they had, quote, repulsed the first wave of Russian attacks. However, over the weekend, Russia began to make small but steady gains, capturing a series of towns near the border. This area around the Kharkiv-Belgorod border is sometimes described as a grey zone, where neither side previously held military positions because its lowland terrain was hard to defend. As of Tuesday morning, it looks like there were basically two prongs to the Russian attack. One running just to the east of the E105, the main road connecting Belgorod and Kharkiv, where the Russians have taken the village of Halaborke and are currently moving towards Liptsi, and one running along the Seversky Donetsk River going directly to Vovchansk. Again, as of Tuesday morning, here the Russians have taken the villages of Orhitseve and Hartishcha, and will probably reach the outskirts of Vovchansk by the time this video goes out. What happens at Vovchansk will be interesting, because it'll be a good test of Ukraine's defensive fortifications. Well-prepared defensive fortifications massively improved Russia's fortunes by stunting Ukraine's much-anticipated counteroffensive last year, and it'll be interesting to see whether Ukraine's fortifications around Vovchansk, which have been in construction for the past few months, can be as effective. Worryingly, Ukrainian officials themselves don't sound overly optimistic, and a Ukrainian commander gave an interview to the BBC on Sunday, where he complained that Ukraine's defensive fortifications were so ill-prepared that the Russians, quote, just walked in. So, what is Russia actually aiming to do here? Well, there are broadly two ways of reading the Kremlin's most recent moves. The first is that this is the precursor to a fully fledged Russian assault on Kharkiv city. This would, in turn, signal that Russia is still committed to its maximalist aims of taking Kiev, or even just all of Ukraine, rather than just the self-declared republics in Donbass. Most analysts are skeptical of this take, however, because they don't think that Russia has the military might to simultaneously hold the front lines in eastern Ukraine and take control of Ukraine's largest cities, which would be immensely demanding. This would also be hard to square with Putin's cabinet reshuffle earlier this week, where he appointed an established economist as his defense minister. While it's generally not a great idea to reach too much into the Kremlin's tea leaves, this appointment does tentatively suggest that the Kremlin is anticipating an attritional war, rather than a rapid combined arms maneuver. And The Economist is there to make sure the Russian state can fund this war for the next few years. Instead, the consensus among well-versed analysts and Ukrainian officials seems to be that this effort is mainly about forcing Ukraine to divert resources and personnel away from the front lines in the east, where the bulk of the fighting is going on, to help the Russians accelerate their advances over there. There have also been reports that Western and Ukrainian officials believe that Russia is trying to create a 10-kilometer thick buffer zone along the border between Kharkiv and Belgorod oblast to prevent Ukrainian shelling of Russian settlements in and around Belgorod, which has become increasingly frequent in recent months, or to stop pro-Ukrainian groups from staging cross-border assaults, as they have done occasionally in the past. If this is the case, while it might mean that Kharkiv isn't immediately at risk, it does still present a difficult dilemma for Ukraine. While the amount of territory changing hands is relatively minimal, Russia is still making steady gains elsewhere on the battlefield, especially in the east. The current source of a lot of the fighting is Chasiv Yar, a small town with a pre-war population of about 12,000 people that lies roughly 10 kilometers west of Bakhmut. Again, it's worth stressing quite how slowly Russia's advance is proceeding in the east. After all, Russian forces took Bakhmut last May, and it's taken them basically 12 months to reach the next urban settlement. But the worry for Ukraine is that further Russian gains could precipitate a more drastic collapse along the Ukrainian front lines, or a political crisis in Kyiv, where a blame game between President Zelensky and some of his military advisors has been escalating since the failed counteroffensive. The arrival of new American weapons as part of the $60 billion aid package passed last month might ease some of the pressure, but Western aid won't solve all of Kyiv's problems, not least because one of the most significant limiting factors for the Ukrainian army at the moment is manpower. In a sense, this second front just exacerbates a pre-existing problem for Ukraine. The war has become attritional, and Russia currently has the upper hand in an attritional conflict. Ultimately, underpinning this topic is a lot of data, whether that's economics, trade patterns, polling, or demographics. A lot of the time in politics, you just have to understand the data. So if you want to get a better grasp on these things, I'd recommend Brilliant. They've just introduced a whole bunch of new data courses, which are perfect for learners of any level, taking you through everything from Bayes' theorem to multiple linear regression. It even uses real datasets from the likes of Starbucks, X, and Spotify to bring things to life. I'm not even a super mathematical person, and I still found it easy and enjoyable to work through. That's because of how Brilliant is designed, built around learning by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. The thing is that, like I said, you can learn all of these things quickly and easily, because Brilliant's courses are split into easy-to-digest chunks. Brilliant helps you build real knowledge in minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have time, replacing mindless scrolling on the train or waiting for coffee with something actually stimulating and rewarding. So get learning across all kinds of STEM subjects for free for a full 30 days by clicking the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know that you came from us, which really helps us out.